Job had exactly $11 in her bank account the morning her phone rang with a Seoul area code, and later she would say that number was the reason she picked up. In a cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago, with the heater rattling like it had a grudge against her, she pressed the phone to her ear and heard a woman's crisp voice ask if she was still interested in the nanny position abroad. Binta said yes before the woman even finished the sentence. 6 weeks later, she was standing outside the tallest black iron gate she had ever seen in her life, in the middle of a Seoul neighborhood so quiet it felt like the streets themselves were holding their breath, staring up at a mansion that looked like it belonged to a king. She did not know yet that in 3 months she would be kneeling on a hospital floor with a dying 5-year-old in her arms, listening to that little girl call her mommy for the first time. She did not know that the man who owned that mansion carried a gun under his tailored jacket, the way other men carried car keys. All she knew, standing at that gate with a suitcase full of secondhand clothes and a heart full of stubborn hope, was that this job was going to change her life. She had absolutely no idea how right she was. Watch till the end, because this story does not end the way you think it does. And if it moves you even a little, hit that like button and subscribe before the tears start, because trust me, they are coming. 3 months earlier, Binta was folding towels at a laundromat on 63rd Street, counting the minutes until her shift ended so she could go pick up her little brother from daycare before the late fee kicked in again. Her mother had passed 2 years back. Her father had never really been in the picture, and it was just her and Malik against the world. Two kids raising each other in an apartment where the lights sometimes went out before the bills got paid. She had dropped out of community college to work full-time, and some nights she cried into her pillow so Malik wouldn't hear her, because the math never worked out no matter how many times she ran it. Rent, food, daycare, the light bill, the water bill, and somehow always $11 left over, like the universe had a cruel sense of humor. So when her cousin Renee mentioned an agency that placed American caregivers with wealthy families overseas, paying triple what she made folding towels, Binta laughed at first. Then she stopped laughing because triple was the difference between Malik eating cereal for dinner and Malik eating an actual meal. The agency lady, a sharp woman named Diane who wore reading glasses on a gold chain, told her the family was Korean, extremely wealthy, extremely private, and needed someone to care for a young girl while the father worked. Binta asked what kind of work required that much privacy and that much money, and Diane just smiled the smile of someone who had learned a long time ago not to ask certain questions if she wanted to keep her commission. Binta should have taken that smile as a warning. Instead, she took it as none of her business, packed one suitcase, left Malik with her Aunt Pearl, and boarded a plane for the first time in her life, gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles turned pale during takeoff, praying under her breath the entire way across the Pacific. Seoul hit her like a wall of noise and neon the second she stepped outside the airport, all glowing signs in a language she couldn't read, and a wave of humid air that smelled like nothing she had ever smelled in Chicago. A driver in a black suit held up a sign with her name spelled wrong, Binta Job, and she almost laughed out loud at the sight of it, deciding right then that if this whole thing turned out to be some kind of scam, at least she'd gotten a free trip out of it. The car ride took nearly an hour, gliding past skyscrapers and then quiet residential streets lined with cherry trees, until they arrived at a gate so tall it blocked out the sun. That was the gate. That was the beginning. Inside, the mansion looked less like a house and more like something out of a movie about people who never had to worry about the price of anything. Marble floors, a staircase that curved like a treble clef, and a woman in a gray uniform named Mrs. O, who looked Binta up and down like she was checking produce at a market and finding it slightly bruised. Mrs. O spoke English with a clipped precision, informing Binta that Mr. Song required absolute discretion, that she was never to ask personal questions, never to enter certain rooms, never to speak to anyone outside the estate about anything she saw or heard inside it. Binta nodded along, thinking this was just rich people paranoia, the kind you saw in movies about old money and older secrets. She had no idea how literal that warning was about to become. She met the little girl before she met the father, and that was the moment everything changed. The child was sitting alone in a sunroom surrounded by more toys than Binta had ever seen in one place. Toys still in their boxes, price tags still attached, Like someone bought happiness in bulk and forgot love had to be delivered separately. The girl had a thin frame, a scarf wrapped around her head instead of hair, and the kind of tired eyes that no 5-year-old should ever have. She looked up at Binta with open curiosity and asked, in surprisingly clear English, if Binta was a chocolate person. Binta blinked, caught off guard, then burst out laughing despite herself and told the girl she guessed she was, if chocolate people came in Chicago flavor. The girl's whole face lit up like someone had switched on a lamp behind her eyes, and she said her name was Ha-eun and that she liked Binta already because Binta laughed with her whole face and not just her mouth like the other nannies did. Right then, standing in that ridiculous sunroom full of unopened toys, Binta felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that she had been sent here for more than a paycheck. The father arrived that evening, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop the second he walked in. Song Hae-jun moved like a man who had never once doubted that a room belonged to him the moment he entered it. Dressed in black from head to toe, jaw set in a permanent line of controlled tension, eyes so sharp they seemed to cut straight through whatever they landed on. He didn't greet Binta so much as inspect her, the same way Mrs. O had, except colder, more clinical, like he was calculating exactly how much of a liability she might become. He told her, in low and measured English, that his daughter was his entire world, that he expected her care to be flawless, and that if Binta had any complaints about the rules of this house, the door was behind her, and she was welcome to use it immediately. Binta, who had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who thought a girl from the South Side didn't have any backbone, looked him dead in the eye and said she didn't come all this way to complain about a job. She came to do it, and unless he planned on folding his own daughter's laundry, he might want to lower that attitude a notch. Mrs. O's teacup nearly slipped out of her hand. Hae-jun's jaw twitched, somewhere between offense and something that almost looked like the beginning of respect, and he walked out of the room without another word. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in her small but comfortable staff quarters, Binta stared at the ceiling and wondered exactly what kind of family she had landed herself in. She noticed things she couldn't quite explain away. Men in dark suits who stood at the gate around the clock, not like security guards exactly, more like soldiers. A steel door in the east wing that Mrs. O had specifically warned her never to approach. The way the household staff went quiet and stiff whenever a certain black car pulled into the driveway. She told herself it was just how rich people lived, paranoid and overprotected, and she pushed the questions down because Ha-eun needed her, and Malik back home needed the money, and some mysteries were better left unsolved when rent was due. The days settled into a rhythm. Binta would wake Ha-eun, help her through her medications, which she quickly learned were for something serious, something involving hospital visits and doctors with grave faces, though nobody would tell her exactly what. She would braid Ha-eun's scarf into little bows just to make the girl laugh, and Ha-eun would in turn try to teach Binta Korean words, dissolving into giggles every time Binta butchered the pronunciation. Ha-eun taught her the word for pretty, and Binta kept saying it wrong on purpose just to hear that laugh, because that laugh had become the best part of her day faster than she wanted to admit. Ha-eun also, without asking permission from anyone, decided that Binta smelled like cookies and should therefore be her best friend forever, a declaration she made with the seriousness of a queen issuing a royal decree. Hae-jun kept his distance those first 2 weeks, disappearing for long stretches, returning at odd hours, smelling faintly of gun oil and cigarette smoke, sometimes with a tightness around his eyes that told Binta something had gone very wrong, somewhere she wasn't allowed to know about. But she noticed him noticing her, catching her mid-laugh with Ha-eun and lingering a half-second longer than necessary in the doorway, before catching himself and walking away, like he'd been caught doing something illegal. One evening she was in the kitchen at midnight raiding the refrigerator for ice cream, because some habits followed her all the way from Chicago, and she nearly jumped out of her skin when she turned around and found him standing there in the dark. Jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking for the first time since she'd met him, less like a mafia boss and more like an exhausted man who hadn't eaten all day. She offered him a spoon before she even thought about the fact that offering your rich employer a spoon out of the same tub of ice cream probably wasn't in any employee handbook. He stared at the spoon like it was a foreign object, then, to her genuine shock, took it and ate straight from the tub sitting right there on the counter beside her, both of them silent, both of them a little stunned that this was happening. She joked that she didn't figure a man like him ate ice cream standing in his own kitchen at midnight, and he replied, dry as sandpaper, that he didn't figure a woman like her would still be employed after the way she talked to him on her first day. She told him the tub was half empty already, so clearly she was doing something right. For the first time since she'd arrived, she watched something crack open in his face, the barest flicker of a real smile, gone as fast as it appeared. But she saw it, and something about seeing it made her chest feel warm in a way she chose not to examine too closely. It was around that time she started putting pieces together that she really wished she hadn't. She overheard two of the suited men in the hallway, speaking low and fast, using a word that even in Korean she recognized because it sounded exactly like it did in English, Mafia, and something about a rival family called the Bayek line, encroaching on territory near the docks. She stood frozen behind the door, heart hammering, suddenly recontextualizing every strange detail of the last 2 weeks. The armed men, the steel door, the way Ha-eun sometimes came home with his knuckles bruised and a look in his eyes like he'd done something he wasn't proud of, but would do again without hesitation. She had signed up to be a nanny for a rich family. She had somehow ended up embedded in the middle of an actual Korean crime syndicate. And the scariest part was that some reckless corner of her heart didn't want to run. She confronted him about it 2 nights later, cornering him in his study with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in the exact posture her grandmother used to call her "don't play with me" stance. She asked him straight out if he was a criminal, and he didn't even try to deny it, which somehow made it worse and more respectable at the same time. He told her, in a voice stripped of all its usual coldness, that his father built an empire out of violence and left it to him whether he wanted it or not. That he had spent his whole adult life trying to keep the worst of that world away from Ha-eun's door, and that every enemy he had ever made was a direct threat to the only person on this earth he actually loved. He said if she wanted to pack her bags and leave tonight, he would have a car ready in 10 minutes and would not think less of her for it. Binta stood there considering it, considering Malik back home, considering the $11 in her account and everything at stake. And then she thought about Ha-eun's laugh and the little scarf bows, and the way that child had looked at her like she'd hung the moon. And she said the only thing she could say, which was that she didn't run from hard things, she ran from lazy men. And he clearly wasn't that. He looked at her for a long moment like he was trying to figure out if she was the bravest woman he'd ever met or the most foolish. And honestly, so was she. Comedy found its way back into the house even under that shadow, because Ha-eun refused to let anybody around her stay sad for long. She staged elaborate tea parties that required Binta, and on one memorable and mortifying occasion, two of Ha-eun's armed guards to sit cross-legged on the floor wearing paper crowns while sipping imaginary tea with their pinkies raised, the guards looking deeply uncomfortable in their suits and holsters, while a 5-year-old scolded them for bad table manners. Binta nearly choked laughing when the biggest guard, a man built like a refrigerator with a scar across his eyebrow, was informed by Ha-eun that he was not allowed dessert until he finished his imaginary vegetables. Even Ha-eun, catching the scene from the hallway, had to turn away and cover his mouth, shoulders shaking with silent laughter he clearly wasn't used to indulging in. The rain came on a Thursday, the kind of sudden soul downpour that soaked you before you even realized it had started, and Binta got caught in it walking back from the market with groceries for Ha-eun's favorite snack. Ha-eun found her on the road, pulled the car over, and instead of simply driving her home, he got out in the rain himself, drenched within seconds, helping her gather the bags that had split open on the pavement. They ended up standing under a bus shelter waiting for the worst of it to pass, both soaked through, both laughing at how ridiculous they looked, water dripping off his usually perfect hair into his eyes. In that shelter with the rain hammering the plastic roof and the whole city blurred into streaks of light behind him, he told her that he hadn't laughed like this in years, that his life before her arrival had been a long gray corridor, and she had somehow opened a window in it he didn't know existed. She told him that was the smoothest thing a mafia boss had ever said to her, and he told her she was the only nanny in history who would dare talk to him that way, and she told him maybe that was exactly why he couldn't stop looking at her, and neither of them denied it. When he reached over and tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her jaw, the air between them went thick and quiet, and for one suspended second, with the rain pounding around them, and the city lights blurring gold. He leaned in and kissed her, soft at first, then deeper, like a man finally allowing himself something he denied himself for years. She kissed him back with her hands fisted in his soaked shirt, and somewhere in the back of her mind she thought very clearly that she was in so much trouble, and she didn't care one bit. Of course, trouble doesn't wait politely for you to enjoy your moment. 3 days later, the Beck family made their move. Binta was walking Ha-eun home from the private garden behind the estate when a black van screeched up beside the low garden wall and two men in ski masks vaulted over it before the guards even had time to react. Binta didn't think, she just moved, scooping Ha-eun up and sprinting for the side door, screaming for help at the top of her lungs, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. One of the men caught her by the arm and she did the only thing her instincts told her to do. She bit down on his wrist as hard as she possibly could, and when he yelped and let go, she kept running. Ha-eun's thin arms locked around her neck, both of them crying, both of them terrified until Ha-eun's men finally swarmed the intruders and dragged them off, gunshots cracking through the quiet neighborhood air like thunder. Ha-eun arrived seconds too late to stop it and seconds in time to see Binta collapse to her knees in the garden, cradling his sobbing daughter, blood on her own arm from where the man's grip had torn her sleeve and skin. And something in his face broke completely open, terror and rage and a love so raw it looked like physical pain. That night, once Ha-eun was finally asleep with a nightlight on and two guards stationed outside her door instead of the usual one, Ha-eun found Binta sitting on the back stairs, still shaking, and he sat down beside her without a word, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He told her that he had almost lost the two people who mattered most to him in the space of 30 seconds, and that he didn't know what he would have done, what kind of man he would have become if either of them hadn't made it home tonight. She told him, voice trembling, that she hadn't come to Korea to fall in love with a gang boss and his sick little girl, that this was absolutely not the plan, and he asked her with something almost like hope cracking through his usual control, what the plan was now. She looked at him and said the plan was apparently getting rewritten in real time, and she was too tired to fight it anymore. He kissed her again that night, slower, steadier, like a promise instead of a question. And for a little while, in that dark stairwell, the danger outside the walls felt very far away. But danger, as it turns out, does not respect timelines, and neither does illness. 2 weeks later, Ha-eun collapsed during breakfast, her small body simply folding over the table, and the household exploded into controlled panic, guards clearing hallways, a private physician summoned within minutes, Ha-eun carrying his daughter to the car himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her. At the hospital, in a sterile room that smelled like bleach and fear, the doctor finally said the words nobody in that house had wanted to say out loud, that Ha-eun's leukemia had progressed, that the treatments were losing ground, that they needed a bone marrow match immediately or they would run out of options entirely. Ha-eun's face went the color of ash. He had already been tested. His marrow wasn't compatible. Extended family had been tested with no luck. The donor registry had nothing. Binta stood in the corner of that hospital room, feeling utterly useless, watching the strongest man she had ever met crumble in real time. And something in her simply refused to accept it. She insisted on being tested too, even though nobody expected it to matter since she had no blood relation to the child whatsoever. But she said stranger things had happened, and she wasn't about to sit around doing nothing while a baby she loved was running out of time. The wait for results felt like it stretched across a decade instead of 2 days. Comedy even found its way into that agonizing waiting room, absurdly, when Ha-eun, drugged up on pain medication and barely conscious, mumbled that Binta better hurry up and be a match because she still owed her 3 more tea parties and a Malibu Barbie she'd promised weeks ago. And Binta laughed so hard she cried, because that was exactly the kind of ridiculous, stubborn hope that had kept this whole family together. The results came back an impossible, beautiful match, some rare genetic quirk the doctors called a miracle of statistics, and for one single breath, the entire hospital room exhaled in relief. But relief in this story never lasts long, because that same night, while preparations for the marrow transplant were underway, the Beck family struck again, this time directly at the hospital, cutting the power to the private wing in an attempt to finish what they'd started in the garden. Alarms blared through pitch darkness, security radios crackled with panicked voices, and Ha-eun, gun drawn, pushed Binta and a barely conscious Ha-eun into a supply closet, telling Binta to lock the door and not open it for anyone but him, before disappearing into the chaos to protect his family the only way he knew how, with violence answered by violence. In that closet, in the dark, with sirens wailing outside and gunfire echoing somewhere down the hall, Ha-eun's small hand found Binta's in the blackness, her voice weak and thin and terrified, and she asked if she was going to die. Binta held that tiny hand against her chest, feeling her own heart threatening to shatter, and told her no, not tonight, not ever if she had anything to say about it. And Ha-eun, in a whisper so soft it barely disturbed the air, said the words that would replay in Binta's mind for the rest of her life, that she loved her and that she wished she was her mommy because her real mommy was gone, and Binta felt exactly like what a mommy should feel like. Binta pressed her lips to that small forehead in the dark and told her she could be that. She could absolutely be that if Ha-eun would just please hold on a little longer. The lights came back on 20 agonizing minutes later. Ha-eun kicked open the supply closet door himself, bloodied at the knuckles but alive, having personally ended the Beck family's interference in a way that made it very clear there would be no third attempt, ever. He found Binta and his daughter huddled together on the floor, and the sight of them both breathing, both safe, brought a grown man who commanded fear across an entire criminal underworld to his knees in that supply closet doorway, tears finally breaking free after weeks of holding himself together by sheer force of will. The transplant happened 2 days later, and the weeks that followed were a blur of monitors, slow recovery, small victories celebrated like grand ones. The first time Ha-eun ate solid food again, the first time she asked for a tea party, the first time her laugh came back, sounding like her old laugh instead of a weak echo of it. Binta stayed by that hospital bed every single day, holding a hand that had once held hers in the dark, and Ha-eun stayed by both of their sides, no longer the cold, guarded man from that first day at the gate, but a man visibly, thoroughly, hopelessly in love with the woman who had walked into his broken family and refused to walk back out. On the morning Ha-eun was finally cleared to go home, dressed in a ridiculous fluffy pink coat that made her look like a marshmallow with legs, she grabbed both Binta's hand and her father's hand and declared, with the full confidence of a fully recovered 5-year-old queen, that they were now officially a family and there would be no further discussion on the matter. Ha-eun, laughing properly for what felt like the first time in his adult life, looked at Binta over their daughter's head and asked, only half joking, if the nanny position came with a lifetime contract, because he had a feeling he was never letting either of them out of his sight again. Binta told him lifetime contracts required a ring, not just paperwork, and he actually laughed out loud at that. A full, unguarded laugh that Mrs. O later swore she had never once heard from him in 15 years of service, before pulling a small velvet box out of his coat pocket that he had apparently been carrying around for a week waiting for exactly the right moment, and getting down on one knee right there in the hospital hallway in front of nurses, guards, and one deliriously delighted little girl in a marshmallow coat who screamed loud enough to bring the entire floor running. Binta Job, the girl from the south side of Chicago who once had $11 to her name, said yes with tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at the exact same time, while Ha-eun jumped up and down, shouting that she was going to be a flower girl and also the boss of the wedding because those were her rules and everybody had to follow them. Malik flew out for the wedding 6 months later, walking Binta down an aisle lined with cherry blossoms in the same garden where masked men had once tried to snatch away everything she loved, and where instead, love had simply refused to leave. Ha-eun, healthy, hair grown back into soft, dark curls she twirled constantly out of sheer joy at having hair again, insisted on carrying the rings herself in a tiny basket she had decorated with stickers, and she made it exactly halfway down the aisle before abandoning all ceremony and sprinting the rest of the way to launch herself into Binta's arms, shouting for the whole garden to hear that her mommy looked like a princess. And in that moment, surrounded by family, both blood and chosen, Binta understood completely why she had answered that phone call with $11 in her account and a whole world of doubt in her heart, because sometimes the most broken places are exactly where the deepest kind of love decides to take root. If this story touched you even a little, even just a bit, do not scroll past without hitting that like button right now, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Binta and Ha-eun's. Subscribe if you want more Afro-Korean mafia romance dropping regularly, because trust me, we are just getting started. Drop a comment below telling me which part hit you hardest, whether it was that supply closet scene, that hospital hallway proposal, or the moment little Ha-eun called her mommy for the very first time. Because I read every single one of them, and your comments genuinely shape where these stories go next. Share this with a friend who needs a good cry and an even better love story today. And if you want to stay locked in for the next episode, make sure that notification bell is on, because trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Want me to move straight into image prompts, thumbnail concepts, or the full SEO package for this one?